Hello everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of Building and Detailing the Revell Monogram B-25J. In this episode, I'm going to teach you how to remove the aileron control surfaces and reattach them. I prefer to remove the control surfaces after the parts have been glued together. I like to use a razor saw and a scribing tool to remove the control surfaces. These tools give me the greatest control in ensuring that the control surfaces are cut out correctly without damaging any of the surrounding plastic. The scribed outlines of the control surfaces are typically not the same on both wings, so it's really important to mark the parts before you remove them. The scribed control surfaces on the upper and lower wings are sometimes slightly different, and this is why I prefer to cut out my control surfaces after the wing parts have been glued together. After removing the ailerons, the next step is to reinforce the interior sections of the wings so there's no flexing which could crack a seam. I carefully slip sections of plastic inside the wings, ensuring that I don't distort the shape of the wing, and then superglue them into place. After the glue dried, I use a sanding stick to square up the left and right sides of the openings. Next, I glued strips of plastic into place with superglue so that the upper and lower surfaces would be flush with one another. I then used a sanding stick and carefully and slowly sanded the plastic down until the upper and lower surfaces were flush. Here's a close-up of the beads of superglue that I added along the edges of the plastic strips to make these parts that I added very strong before I started sanding. Next, you need to seal the opening in each wing with oversized sections of plastic so that you can carefully trim the plastic and sand it smooth and contour it to the surfaces of the wing. These sections of plastic need to sit flat against the openings in the wings, and this is why it's important to have the upper and lower sections flush with one another. I carefully peel away the excess plastic with a number 11 X-Acto blade, ensuring that I don't gouge the surface of the wings, and then use a sanding stick to smooth it all out. After my initial sanding was complete, I added some silver paint to check for flaws, and those areas were filled with superglue and then resanded, and then I checked it again to ensure that both surfaces on both sides of each wing were perfect. Next, the inner edges of each opening where the ailerons will go need to be filled. Here again, I used oversized pieces of plastic so that I could carefully position them, and then once the glue dried, I added beads of superglue on the outside perimeter for strength. These smaller sections were carefully trimmed and sanded smooth and contoured onto the edges of the wing using the same techniques as the long plastic sections. The ailerons were then positioned in place with tape, and then sections of plastic were added so that the spacing between the ailerons and the wings were nice and tight. These sections of plastic were superglued into place, and here again, beads of superglue were added around the outside perimeters for added strength. The plastic strips were then carefully trimmed with a number 11 X-Acto blade and then sanded smooth and contoured to the surface. After all the sanding and trimming is complete on the ailerons, I rechecked them and positioned them into the wings to ensure that they were nice and tight. The tiny openings along the lengths of the ailerons were sealed with superglue. The parts were then run across a stationary piece of sandpaper to smooth out the superglue as well as the plastic to ensure that the lengths were straight. To round off the edges of the ailerons, I ran the edges over a stationary piece of sandpaper while rotating the part up so that the sandpaper rounded the edges. Using the engraved outlines for the hinges as a guide, I used a set of microfiles to open the hinge areas and to shape them so that the hinges I'm going to add to the wings would fit properly. The ailerons were then taped back into place on the wings, and then oversized sections of plastic were carefully sanded and trimmed to shape so that they fit tightly in the openings in the ailerons. The tiny strips were then positioned straight and then superglued into place. Tiny beads of superglue were then added along the rest of the perimeter so that these tiny hinges would be very strong. The strips of plastic were then cut flush with the surfaces of the wings, and then a sanding stick was used to round off the square edges. The ailerons were then taped back into place to ensure that everything fit tightly together. And sure enough, the ailerons fit tightly into the wings and everything looks good. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed episode 2 and the techniques that I used to remove the ailerons and reattach them. In episode 3, I'm going to show you 2 different techniques that I use to remove the elevators and reattach them. So stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Scale Modeling with Mike Ashey.